Hey everyone, so we're back at Ban This Book, and we are going to find out what happens and with Amy Ann and her lovely BBLL Banned Book Locker Library. The ayes have it. The very next day, Mrs. Spencer and her friends went through the stacks looking at every single book. Mrs. Jones stood a few feet from them, watching them with her arms crossed on her big blue polka-dotted dress as they flipped through the books looking for anything they didn't like. But there was nothing she could do. Behind them on a table was a tower of books removed for further review. I guess Mrs. Spencer didn't like Mrs. Jones' author visit stunt very much. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting of the BBLL board during language arts. Rebecca and Danny and I got library passes and sat at one of the study tables. All around us, the shelves had big holes in them where Mrs. Spencer and her friends had taken books away. We have to do something, I told them. What? Rebecca said. We have to get copies of all the books they're taking off the shelves, Danny said. Where will we put all of them? This is way more than we could fit in Amy Ann's locker, Rebecca said. My locker, Danny said. Your locker. We have to find room. But we don't have enough money to buy them all, and we never will, Rebecca said. Not even if we had a bake sale every day. Unless Amy Ann can get every author to donate copies like Dave Pilkey. I sucked on a braid, thinking, there has to be another way, I said. What about it? Rebecca asked Danny. You're head of acquisitions. Danny combed his hair with his fingers. Well, I actually do have an idea. I know where we can get a copy of every single book taken off the shelves, for free even. Where? Danny nodded at the big glass window that separated Mrs. Jones' office from the rest of the library. I frowned until I saw what he was talking about. The shelf in the back corner of the office where Mrs. Jones kept all the books she had pulled off the shelves. Rebecca gasped. You mean steal them? It's not stealing, Danny said. They're library books. The whole reason they're here in the first place is to loan out to kids. So we're basically borrowing them, right? I felt slightly sick at the thought of sneaking into Mrs. Jones's office and taking something, even if it would mean we had every book Mrs. Spencer banned. Danny could see we weren't convinced. Look, Mrs. Jones bought those books so any kid could read them. That's what we're going to do with them. Let any kid read them. She would want us to. So why don't we just ask her for them? Rebecca said. Because she can't give them to us, I said. Not without losing her job. The school board told her not to, and she has to do what the school board says. I stared at the books. We can't take all of them, or Mrs. Jones will notice, Danny said. We don't need all of them, I said. We already have half of them. I can't believe we're considering this, Rebecca said. Forget suing us. Theft is a misdemeanor. Does that mean we could go to jail? I asked. Well, no, not for stealing a few books. Restitution and community service, maybe. What's restitution? Danny said. We have to return the books or pay for them, Rebecca explained. And it would very likely go down on our permanent records, which could mean we don't get into college. Danny flicked his hair back. I'm okay with that. Danny, Rebecca said. I chewed on my braid. Stealing was bad. I knew that. I hadn't stolen a thing since the lollipop when I was little, but banning books was worse. I make a motion to borrow the books we don't already have. Have in the BBLL for Mrs. Jones's office, I said. Second, Danny said. All those in favor? I asked. Aye, Danny said, pulling an eyelid down with a finger. I looked at Rebecca. You don't need my yes, she said. You've already got enough votes. You don't have to help if you don't want to, I told her. Rebecca sighed. Well, if I get in trouble, I do know a good lawyer. The ayes have it, Danny said, standing. Let's do this. What? Now? Rebecca said. Sure, he said. What are we waiting for? Helen to come? Wait, I said. First of all, Mrs. Jones is at the front desk. So we'll distract her, Danny said. And I said, there's an alarm that goes off if you try to take a book out without checking it out, remember? Oh, Danny said. How do we get around that? Chuck 'em over it? I doubt that would work. And I could just see myself trying to catch books out in the hall as Danny tossed them over the scanners. If it was anything like trying to catch a football in gym class, there would be busted books all over the floor. The only way we were going to be able to get away with this was to run the books over the machine in the front desk that demagnetized them or whatever it did. For some weird reason, that made me think of the picture Trey had drawn for the right to assemble, with the one person holding up a sign that said magnets. How do they work? We'll use this thing on the desk, I told them. The thing Mrs. Jones runs the books over them so the alarm doesn't go off, but that means we need a long distraction. I got this, Danny said. He pulled a book off one of the shelves around us, opened his messy backpack, and buried it as far down inside as he could. What are you going to do? Rebecca said. He hefted his book bag onto his shoulders and headed for the front door. I'm going to set off the alarm. Rebecca and I hurried around the aisle to where we could watch the entrance and the front desk. My heart was in my throat. I couldn't believe I was about to do this. What kind of person had I become that I would ask an author during a school visit what he thought about his books being banned? Who would steal books from a library to loan them out of my own secret locker library? Danny stepped between the two white plastic pedestals at the door and the alarm went off. Wonk, 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 wonk. Even though it wasn't very loud, the sound of it and the red flashing lights made me and Rebecca both jump. Danny jumped too, even though he'd been expecting it. Mrs. Jones stirred from her seat at the front desk. Danny, do you have a book in your backpack you haven't checked out? Danny flicked his hair out of his eyes. Geez, I don't think so, Mrs. Jones, he said. He tried to go back through the alarm, but the alarm went off again. Mrs. Jones came out from behind her desk and went to him. Here, let's take a look. Danny's eyes flicked to mine. It was now or never. I motioned for Rebecca to wait for me and hurried behind Mrs. Jones' desk. I was the one who knew what books we needed, and she could holler if Mrs. Jones was coming back. I ran to the shelf at the back, my whole body shaking. I skimmed the titles on the spines once all the way through before realizing that I hadn't even read a single word. I was freaking out. I needed to calm down, think, reread the titles. I frowned. Not all of these were on the banned book list. Then I saw the label on the shelf. Remove, replace. Some of these books were just old and worn out, and Mrs. Jones was going to order new copies. That would help disguise the fact that I'd taken a few. I glanced over my shoulder. Rebecca glanced at Danny, who I couldn't see, and back to me. Her eyes told me to hurry, but not to run. Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. Matilda. Love you bunches. The Midwife's Apprentice. Harriet the Spy. The Great Brain. More Adventures of the Great Brain. And Tango Makes Three. The Diary of a Young Girl. The Giver. In the Night Kitchen. Caroline. Coraline. The Golden Compass. The Face on the Milk Carton. A Day No Pigs Would Die. I went through the list in my head, ticking off all the books that didn't already have a little green mark on the sheet hidden inside my Go Eagles #1 sign on my locker. When I was finished, I had a stack that reached up to my chin. I hurried back out to the front desk with them. I was shaking so bad I was sure I was going to trip and spill all the books. I made it to the front desk, just as the books were tipping over, but Rebecca helped me catch them. I glanced over the entrance. Danny was there, on the floor, pulling things out of his backpack, one at a time for Mrs. Jones. There's that language arts assignment, he said. I meant to turn that in. And hey, I've been looking for this hairbrush forever. Hurry, Rebecca whispered. I took the first book to the demagnetizer thing. I didn't really know how the thing worked. Did you have to push a button or something? I didn't see any buttons on it. Instead, I just did what Mrs. Jones always does. I stuck the spine of the book into the corner of it and moved it around. The machine made a little sound, bonk, and then a light lit up green. Success! I let out a big breath. I hadn't realized I'd even been holding. I shoved the book at Rebecca, glanced over at Danny. He was pulling a plastic food container out of his backpack. Oh, man, what's growing in that? He said. I hurried and rubbed more books over the machine. My backpack's full, Rebecca said, when I'd gotten about halfway through. Go, go, I told her, and she jogged forward towards the door. I took a second to watch her, half afraid Mrs. Jones would somehow psychically know she had the banned books in her bag, and half afraid I hadn't demagnetized them the right way. Rebecca probably had the exact same fear because she slowed down just as she got to Danny and Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones had lost her patience with Danny and was looking in his backpack for him. Rebecca shot me a last look and she skipped through the alarms. It didn't go off. Rebecca was out. Here we are, Mrs. Jones said, pulling a book from Danny's backpack. Big Wig, A Little History of Hair, Mrs. Jones read. What? Danny said. He flicked his hair out of his eyes so he could read it. Oh yeah, it's for a project I'm doing about hair. Well, you'll need to check it out if you want to take it from the library, Mrs. Jones said. Danny looked my way in panic. I still had a small stack of books to demagnetize. I took a handful of them, stuck them in the machine all at once. The light lit up green. I took the other handful of them and did the same thing. Green. I would just have to hope I took care of them all. I piled the books in my arms, scurried out from behind the desk just as Mrs. Jones and Danny came over. She hadn't seen me. Now, to stuff all of it in my backpack but my backpack was already full. It was filled to the top with all the textbooks that wouldn't fit in my locker. What was I going to do? I looked at the clock. I had to get back to class. Danny was already gone from the front desk. With no other choice, I slipped on my backpack, turned the books around so the titles all faced me, and headed for the exit. Just a few more steps, and then I remembered that I had demagnetized the books in handfuls. Were they all clean? Will one of them give me away? I held my breath and stepped through the sensors. Nothing. I was free. Amy Ann? Mrs. Jones called. I froze. She knew I had heard her. I couldn't pretend I couldn't. I turned. No goodbye? Mrs. Jones said with a smile. I let out a sound that was something between oh and a frog croaking, then managed a wimpy grin. Goodbye, before hurrying away. The Golden Hoard. I sat on my bed surrounded by books. I stacked them by size, then stacked them alphabetically, then stacked them by books I'd read and books I hadn't. I loved the weight of them, the feel of them, especially the hardback books with the clear plastic covers that crinkled and crackled as you opened the book. Some of them were older than I was. Some of them were brand new, and all of them had been banned. It was a treasure trove, these stacks, and suddenly I had the idea that I was Smaug the dragon, sitting on my pile of gold and jewels. I would do anything to keep that hobbit and those dwarves from taking them back. How had I not seen books as treasure before? I loved books. I couldn't imagine living without them, but I had never seen each book as such a valuable thing before. Even the books I wasn't interested in reading were like gold. It didn't matter what was inside them. One man's junk is another man's treasure. As my grandmother said, the same thing was true with books. One person's Captain Underpants was another person's from the mixed-up files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweller. I didn't have time to sit around thinking about it for too long, though. The house was quiet, beautifully, unbelievably quiet, but it wouldn't last. Mom was in the kitchen on her laptop. Angelina was at Gymboree, running around like a racehorse, and Alexis was at ballet. In an hour, Dad would bring them home, and it would be chaos again. Even the dogs were quiet, curled up and sacked on Alexis's bed. For the next few minutes, my world was all mine, and I had work to do. Work I didn't want anyone else to see me doing. Some of the books were new enough that they needed card slots pasted onto the back. Some of them already had envelopes, and all I had to do was take out the old Shelbourne Elementary Library due date card and replace it with one of mine. The old cards were fun to look at. I loved the typewriter font on the top, listing the title and the author, and the long list of scribbled signatures with red due dates stamped beside them. Sometimes you see the same name over and over again. I imagine what that card from the mixed-up files of Miss Basil E. Frankweller would look like if they still checked books out like this today. My name would be in every slot, and onto the back by now. One girl had checked out Harriet the Spy 3 times. I saw her name again on the Matilda card. If I had gone to Shelbourne Elementary in 1985, she and I might have been friends. I pulled the card out of the next book and skimmed down it, looking for a familiar name, and then I saw one, a very familiar one. Was it? No. Could it be? No, it couldn't be. But the more I stared at it, the more I thought. It has to be. That card was a keeper. Princesses 1 through 9. Jeffrey Gonzalez was back from his suspension. He sat at the seat in our classroom, arms folded, staring at his empty desk. Everybody else stayed clear of him, but I went up to him before class. "Hey," I said, "I'm sorry you got suspended." Jeffrey shrugged. "Whatever." I didn't know if you did it for us or... Jeffrey frowned. "What?" "You know," I lowered my voice. "Because Coltrane dropped that book in the cafeteria, Principal Benwowski was about to pick it up when..." "I didn't do it for you," Jeffrey said bitterly. "I didn't do it for anybody. He was in my seat." "Okay," I said. "Well, anyway, thanks. Live long and prosper." Live long and prosper was a thing Jeffrey liked to tell people. It was from Star Wars or something. "Yeah," he said, "right." I left Jeffrey under his little black cloud. What was wrong with him? Usually he was drawing spaceships all over his notebooks and using the Force to try and make the papier-mâché planets that hung from the ceiling spin backwards. Now he was just angry all the time. "All right, everybody, language arts time," Mr. Vaughn said. "It's free reading Friday, so get out whatever you brought to read. I'm going to do the same." Free Reading Friday was my all-time favorite thing about Mr. Vaughn's class. Every Friday for language arts, we all got to sit around the room and read anything we wanted to, as long as it wasn't a book for school. Even Mr. Vaughn read. He'd been reading an Agatha Christie mystery called Murder on the Orient Express. I pulled out the Mysterious Benedict Society and the Prisoner's Dilemma, and opened it to my bookmark. I was just starting the part where the Mysterious Benedict Society falls into the trap when I heard Mr. Vaughn ask someone across the room, "The 17th Princess? What's that about?" I looked up with a squeak. Danny and Rebecca were gawking too. The 17th Princess was one of our fake covers. Someone was reading one of the BBLL books in class, and Mr. Vaughn had caught her. It was Lacey Edwards. Lacey was the tallest girl in 4th grade. She looked up at me in horror. The book wasn't about the 17th princesses, of course. Inside was, "Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret." I gave her a look that said, "Make something up." Lacey had to look at the cover to see what the title was. "It's about the 17th princess," she said. Mr. Vaughn laughed. "Well, I gathered that. What happened to the first 16? "Well, the first one fell into a pot of boiling oil," Lacey said. "Ouch," Mr. Vaughn said. "The second one ate a poisoned apple." "Always a classic," said Mr. Vaughn. "The third one got sat on by a giant." Some of the kids around Lacey laughed. People were starting to pay attention to her. "The fourth one turned into a werewolf. The fifth one got eaten by a giant skunk. The sixth one choked on her own snot." "Ew," the class said, half laughing and half gagging. I sucked on a braid. Why in the world did we have to make it 17 princesses? "The seventh princess got kicked in the face with a soccer ball," Lacey said. She was really getting into it now. "The eighth princess, she stuck her tongue out an electric socket." The other kids cheered for that one, and Mr. Vaughn looked around at them, amused and concerned all at the same time. "The ninth princess accidentally sat on her crown," Lacey said. "The 10th princess..." All right, Mr. Vaughn said. "I'm afraid if we go all the way to 17, language arts class will be over before anyone's done any reading." He shook his head. "That's a strange book you've got there, but it sounds fun." Mr. Vaughn left Lacey's desk to go sit in the big chair in the front of the room and read his book. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I saw Danny and Rebecca do the same. That had been a close one. I guess we should be lucky the cover hadn't been "Smell My Finger." I was about to go back to my book when I saw one other person looking across the room at me. Trey McBride. He glanced over at Lacey, then back to me, then disappeared behind an Amulet graphic novel. New customers. At lunch, Jeffrey sat by himself. He had friends before, other kids who liked talking about the same kinds of movies and shows he did, but no one wanted to sit with him now. Jeffrey seemed to want it that way. He picked fights with anybody who hung out with him too long. I stared across the room at Space Cadet Jeff, feeling sorry for him. He'd always been a nice guy before. He'd been like this for a while now, ever since that day we both got called to the office. He wasn't angry before that. What had Principal Benwowski been telling him as they came out of the office? Something about how she was sure his grandmother had been a nice person? Jeffrey's grandmother must have died. Was that why he was so mad? I could understand him being sad, but why was he so angry all the time? Then I remembered the books I had read where people died. Sometimes the characters refused to believe it. Sometimes they just got to where they shut down and didn't want to do anything, and sometimes they got really mad. I had a book like that in my locker, in fact. After lunch, I wrote a note that said I wanted to talk and left it in Jeffrey's locker mailbox. He met me at my locker after school with a note in his hand. "What?" he said. "Hi, Jeffrey," I said. "I didn't know where to start. I know your grandmother died." Jeffrey looked away, looking at the lockers. "So?" he said. "I just wanted you to know that I know that what you're going through is really hard," I said. His eyes flashed to mine, and I saw that Jeffrey who'd gotten suspended for fighting. "Oh, yeah?" he said. "Did your grandmother die?" "No," I said. "Then you don't know," he said. "But I've read about it," I said. "In a book?" Jeffrey snorted and looked away. I opened my locker and showed him the book. "Mr. Bear opens a bank account?" he said. "Oh, no, that's just a fake cover we put on to fool the teachers." I opened it up to show him. "It's called Bridge to Terabithia. I think you should read it." Jeffrey looked at the book in my hands, but didn't take it. "It sounds stupid," Jeffrey said. "It's not. It's really good," I told him. "It's about these two kids who invent this pretend kingdom and become the king and queen, and I think you'll really like it." I held the book out to Jeffrey, and he finally took it. "I'll read it, maybe," he said. "Okay," I said. I hoped he would. Jeffrey walked away and I turned. Trey McBride was standing right beside me. I jumped out of my skin, then remembered to slam my locker shut and slip on the lock. "Hey," Trey said. "Hey," I said back. I tried not to sound nervous, even though I was. Every time I turned around, there he was. He stood there for a few seconds, just looking at me, but not saying anything. What did he want? Our First Amendment project was already finished. "I want to borrow a book," Trey said. "What?" I swallowed hard. "The school library is right down the hall," I told him. "I want to borrow a book from you, from your locker." "I don't know what you're—" "I want to borrow Captain Underpants," he told me. "I know you have it." Trey flipped me the Go Eagles #1 sign on my locker and pointed to the list of banned books on the back. "The green dots mean you have them, right? I want to read this one." My own little patch of quicksand was opening up underneath me. Trey knew all about the BBLL. Did that mean his mom knew too? Maybe she did. Maybe Trey had figured it out and told his mom, but instead of going right to the principal, she'd sent him there to check out a book as evidence. I shook my head. I was beginning to think like Rebecca. "No, you don't have to. Or no, you won't let me check it out." "No, you don't have it, or no, you won't let me check it out?" Trey asked. He'd taken my head shake for a no. I didn't know what to tell him. If I gave him the book and he took it to his mom, it was all over, and I was in big trouble. But if Trey really just wanted to read the book, didn't all this start when he checked out Captain Underpants from the school library to read it? I gotten to know Trey working together on our First Amendment project, and I'd started to like him, despite him drawing me as a mouse in 3rd grade. And it was Trey's mom who banned the books, not Trey. Maybe he didn't agree with her at all. Maybe he just really wanted to read Captain Underpants. And that's why I had the banned books locker library to begin with, wasn't it? So anybody who wanted to read a book could from the school library? Trey looked disappointed at me and turned to leave. "Wait," I said. "I do have one, and you can borrow it." I was saying all kinds of crazy things out loud these days. I spun the dial on my locker and yanked it open and got out Captain Underpants. Trey's eyes lit up. "Do you have the 4th one? Captain Underpants and the Perilous Plot of Professor Poopy Pants?" I did. My biggest mistake. I knew I was in trouble from the moment I set foot in the building Monday. It was in the way the other kids stared at me, then turned to their friends to whisper, the way everybody moved out of my way like I was Hagrid parting crowds in Diagon Alley, the way my sneakers squeaked loud enough for me to hear them in the quiet hall. A chill ran down my spine and I got goosebumps, and not the R.L. Stein kind. My footsteps slowed and my heart pounded in my chest. Something was wrong here, very, very wrong. And then I turned the corner and saw Principal Benwowski standing next to my locker. Mr. Crutchfield, the Shelbourne Elementary custodian, stood next to her, with the long-handled metal cutters he used to cut off locks when kids forgot their combinations. No, I thought, no, 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 no. Miss Olinger, Principal Bumwowski said, I need you to open your locker, please. I started crying. I couldn't help it. Even with everybody watching, tears streamed down my face, and I sobbed once. This couldn't be happening. Miss Bumwowski wasn't really standing in front of my locker telling me to open it. I was still asleep. I was dreaming. I had to be. This was a nightmare because if Miss Bumwowski was there telling me to open my locker, that meant it was all over. Miss Olinger, if you won't open the lock, I'll have to ask Mr. Crutchfield to cut it off. I wanted to say something. I wanted to do something, but all I did was stand there and cry. I was barely even aware of all the other kids who had gathered around to gawk. All right, Mr. Crutchfield, Principal Bumwowski said. Through my watery eyes, I watched him slip the cutters around the lock and squeeze. The lock popped, and Mrs. Bumwowski removed it. The hallway was completely silent as Principal Bumwowski opened my locker. The chink-chink of the handle on my locker echoed, and the quiet sounded like handcuffs going on my wrists. I wanted to fall to my knees. Where was my quicksand? I wanted it now. I wanted to be swallowed up by the ground and disappear forever, but there I stood watching through my tears as Principal Bumwowski pulled books out of my locker library. The covers didn't fool her for 1 second. She already knew. She opened one of, then another, until she was satisfied they were illegal books. They all were. My locker was stacked full of them from top to bottom. I let the backpack filled with my schoolbooks slide to the ground. Mr. Crutchfield, if you collect all these books in the locker and bring them to my office, Principal Bumwowski said. Miss Olinger, you'll come to the office with me and you'll call your parents. I followed along numb. I saw Rebecca, her hand to her mouth and her tears running down her face. I saw Danny, whose painted eyes stared at me from under his perfect hair. I saw Javi and Hannah and Parker and Sophia and Felicia and TJ and a bunch of other people who borrowed books from the BBLL as they watched me get taken away like a criminal. And there, at the end of the hall, was Trey. His mother stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders, looking at me like I had just slapped her in the face. Loaning that book to Trey had been the biggest mistake of my life. I'm just going to stop there. So we'll find out what happens to Amy Ann and all of her books next time.